Welcome. Settle down. You're just in time for a story. It's a story about Jesus. They're my favourite stories of all. This one happened when Jesus was staying with us in Bethany, not long after he brought Lazarus back from the dead. It was just before Passover, the festival of freedom. And you know how Jerusalem gets at Passover? Thousands of pilgrims pouring into the city from all over Israel to celebrate freedom from slavery. Lots of bustle and excitement, people preparing for big parties, and the Romans all on edge in case the crowds stir up a rebellion against the empire. So Jesus and his friends stayed with us in Bethany. It's so handy for Jerusalem, isn't it? It's just a couple of miles' walk. They were spending the days in among the crowds in the city, and then they'd come back to Bethany in the evening and have a bit of peace and quiet. But something just didn't feel quite right. We should have been celebrating. Lazarus was back from the dead, it was Passover, it should have been time to party. But things were just a bit subdued. I don't know how we didn't realise at the time that things were getting dangerous. Jesus did try to warn us, but we just didn't or couldn't really hear what he was saying. I guess we didn't want to believe it. So, like the others, I'd pushed aside that niggling feeling of fear. Looking back, I realised it was around that time they'd started plotting to have Jesus killed. And in shady corners of the city, the powers that be were trying to find a way to arrest him without causing a riot. I suppose we were in denial. We just loved spending time with Jesus and listening to him talk, and we couldn't accept that there was a crisis looming, which would change everything. Anyway, back to the story. As I said, it was just before Passover and we'd all got together for a meal at Simon's house. You know Simon, he's married to Joanna's cousin. Yep, that's right. They live in Bethany now. When Jesus healed Simon from leprosy, they decided to have a fresh start, so they moved here. Bethany's handy for Jerusalem and that's good for trade, so business is good. They've always got a house full and they certainly know how to put on a good spread. So we'd all had plenty to eat and we were reclining around the low table listening to Jesus. I looked round the room and I was struck by what a varied group of people we were and how all our lives had changed since we met Jesus. There's Lazarus, brought back from the dead, Simon, healed from leprosy, the guys from Galilee who'd left their fishing business behind to follow Jesus, Jairus, the Jewish leader whose daughter Jesus brought back from the dead, Matthew. Well, he used to be an outcast, a Roman collaborator and tax collector, but even he found acceptance with Jesus and left behind his piles of money to follow him. What a ragtag bunch we were. People whose paths wouldn't normally cross, brought together by our love for Jesus, who welcomes everyone just as they are, and then completely changes our lives. As I was pondering over all this, I noticed Mary drawing near to Jesus. We'd spent enough time with Jesus by then that we weren't shocked, but it's easy to forget how unusual it was. In that setting, it just wasn't our place as women to be sitting with the men, listening to the teacher. But as I say, Jesus was quite unconventional at the best of times, so we'd got used to him welcoming anyone who wanted to listen to his teaching, whoever they were. But I know Mary as a sister. I could see that she had a slightly reckless look about her, and I could see Jesus had picked up on it too. He always has a way of really seeing people. Mary tends to dance to a different drumbeat to the rest of us, which can make her a bit nerve-wracking to be around, but it also means sometimes she gets things right when the rest of us miss the point. Jesus stopped talking and smiled at Mary. So there was a bit of a lull in the conversation. And what happened next shocked us all. I don't think any of us will ever forget it. Mary brought out a beautiful alabaster jar full of really expensive perfume. I mean, each drop would probably cost £100 or so, so it was the kind of thing you'd keep and you'd never use because, I mean, what occasion would be special enough for that? Well, Mary only went and broke the jar and poured all the oil over Jesus' head, every single drop, all in one go. It filled the room with fragrance. How can I describe it? Rich, exotic, intense. The oil was trickling down Jesus' hair, onto his face, down his neck, and then Mary laid her hands on his head. It was almost like some kind of coronation ceremony. I mean, that's what they used to do for a new king, wasn't it? Anoint their head with oil. And in that moment, Jesus did look like a king. That was one of the things about Jesus. One moment, he was totally down to earth, scrabbling around in the dirt, playing with the kids, chatting with the down and outs. And then, at other times, he had this kind of majesty about him that just made us feel like we should be on our knees before him. And this was one of those moments. His oily face was glistening in the lamplight, and it gave him a kind of ethereal glow. His eyes were closed and he was smiling, but it was a solemn smile, full of dignity and grace. For a bit, I just gazed at him. I was kind of taken up in the moment. And then I came to my senses. What just happened? In her exuberance, Mary had just poured about £20,000 worth of precious oil over the head of a man. It seemed so irresponsible, so inappropriate, I just wasn't sure how to respond. As I looked around the room, I could see I wasn't the only one feeling uncomfortable. Some were clearly embarrassed by such a passionate display of devotion in front of all these people. They were smirking and shuffling about awkwardly, not sure where to look. But there were also indignant faces, frowns and pursed lips. Someone was muttering about how you could have fed a family or two for a year with the money that oil was worth. Every good Jew knows how important it is to look after the poor. What a waste! But after a few moments, the mutters and the sniggers died down and it was quiet. The smell of the perfume was heavy and spicy, and it was becoming almost oppressive. We were all looking at Jesus, waiting to see how he'd react. And we knew Jesus well enough to expect that he wouldn't react as we expected. He looked up, and his eyes were wet with tears. But they were tears of love, not anger. I was confused. Surely Jesus wants us to look after the poor. Didn't he see how wasteful this was? But somehow it also felt like there was something else going on here, something the rest of us hadn't grasped. The heavy smell of the perfume was clouding my thinking, and the room was now full of tension. Jesus looked round at us all. And when Jesus looks at you, he has a way of really seeing you, seeing right into your soul. And then he spoke. He told us to leave Mary alone, because what she'd done was a beautiful thing. Yes, he said, care for the poor, but we'd have the rest of our lives to do that. And then he said that he wasn't going to be with us for much longer. There it was again, the hint of trouble coming. That thing we'd been trying to ignore. My sense of uneasiness was growing. Then Jesus said something strange. Looking back after everything that happened, it kind of made sense, but at the time it just seemed like such an odd thing to say. He said that Mary had poured perfume over him to prepare his body for burial. Not anointing him as a king, but anointing him for death. Well, as if we weren't confused enough already. I could see that Judas was really angry. This wasn't what he'd signed up for at all. He was looking for a powerful leader who'd overthrow the enemy and restore Israel's freedom. This talk of burial, This wasn't the inspiring speech of a hero on the eve of victory. I noticed Judas slip out into the darkness a few minutes later, and looking back, I think that's when he turned traitor. That was another thing none of us realised at the time. Then Jesus said another thing that really stuck with me. He said that Mary had given him what she could, and that what she did would be remembered and spoken of wherever the good news about Jesus is preached throughout the world. There was so much in those words. Not just the strange way he talked about his death as being good news, or that it would spread all over the world, but that Mary gave him what she could. Mary gave him what she could. It wasn't long before we saw Jesus give us everything he could. And when I saw him on the cross, giving his life for us, it left me thinking, what could I give him? What could I give him? The only answer that fits is everything. Everything I have, everything I desire, everything I fear, everything I hope for, everything I am. I often think back to that evening in Bethany. I can still smell the perfume. And for me, that will always be the smell of devotion, the smell of worship, the smell of sacrifice.